Bienvenidos a todos, a todas, nuevamente a el III Congreso Internacional de Derecho a la Educación, Innovación Docente y Mejora Educativa. Vamos a seguir con este programa con el profesor Mike Jess de la Universidad de Edimburgo, que ya nos acompaña. Recordarles que este acto va a ser grabado, con lo cual cualquier intervención que realicen por escrito, a través del audio o por videoconferencia, pues bueno, ustedes cederán su autorización para el tratamiento de los mismos, que será la difusión de este congreso. Voy a compartir ahora lo que va a ser la presentación del profesor Mike Jess. Antes de que empecemos, me gustaría presentarle para que ustedes conozcan un poco más sobre él. So, Professor Mike Jess, you're more than welcome to this third International Congress of the Right to Education. Before we start, I would like to introduce you. Professor Mike Jess is a senior lecturer in physical education from the University of Edinburgh. He is the coordinator of the Developmental Physical Education Group, which is a group of teachers, educators, teachers, and researchers focused on innovation in curriculum, pedagogy, professional learning, and policy. Professor Mike Jess has more than 30 years of experience in undergraduate and postgraduate course developments, and his personal interests include the relationship between complexity thinking, ecological perspective and practice, also the self-study, the personal vision, lesson study, and boundary crossing. He was previously the Joint Director of the Scottish Primary Physical Education Project, which was a £6 million project set up by the Scottish Government to help over 1,000 primary teachers to develop a specialism in physical education. Recently, he has been the consultant for the renovation of general project in Vietnam and pre-service teacher reform project in Myanmar. He has been the presenter at many international conferences and has written extensively on children's physical education. So it's my pleasure to introduce you, Professor Mike Jess.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I will present. I have about 16 slides. Hopefully, I will not speak too quickly. And if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them. As Teresa was just talking there, this idea of personal visions is something that I suppose I have been involved in or interested in probably since the very start of my career, but probably didn't realize the importance of it as a teacher educator until relatively recently. And particularly with Paul McMillan at the University of Edinburgh, we have been working, as I look about, in one course for the last 7 or 8 years, and there has been this gradual move towards working with the students on the idea of their personal visions for physical education, and particularly, as I will highlight, from an educational perspective. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm delighted to say that the study that I'm going to talk about was just accepted for publication in the Curriculum Journal 4 days ago. So this study will be published in a very short period of time. So I want to start by sort of, in the context of physical education, saying why personal vision. And for me, increasingly, the notion of becoming and the work of Gilles Deleuze, which I haven't read a great deal about, but I am becoming more and more conscious of, is really starting to inform my and my colleagues' thinking about this idea of vision. So first, physical education, I think, although in much of the literature it is presented as quite a narrow focus, particularly on the physical, I think in the last 20 years, since the turn of the century, we have seen physical education really start to become. So it's not a static subject area, but it is increasingly becoming. And that becoming, if you look at the literature, and if you look at what's happening, is very much about the different disciplines that are informing what physical education looks like, the different curriculum approaches, and these curriculum approaches are increasingly becoming educational, particularly in a holistic sense, where the physical, the cognitive, the social, and the emotional integrate to form experiences that are not purely about the physical. So we're seeing physical education at the start of the 21st century becoming much more complex, much more multifaceted, and something that I think will become a significant strength from an educational perspective as the century moves forward. However, quite ironically perhaps, at the same time, neoliberal government policy, very much driven by the notions of marketization and outsourcing, have created a slightly tense context for these many developments to come about and take place. And part of that is that we see many new stakeholders involved in physical education. People from sport, people from health, people from other areas of interest. Again, I think this makes physical education extremely vibrant and exciting, but it also has the potential to be quite narrow and perhaps return physical education to that rather straightforward, simplistic physical focus than it had many years ago. So I think I'm trying to just get this idea over first, that PE is this complex becoming subject area, and the arena in which it's developing is becoming increasingly interesting and increasingly challenging, but I would argue perhaps increasingly exciting. However, and I think this is where we start to move towards the idea of personal visions, because now for physical education teachers, in fact, for physical education teacher educators, for physical education researchers, for physical education academics, there is a need to always be becoming, to keep up to date and develop as a professional or as an academic in the 21st century. It is not about somebody being technically just a good teacher. So the complexity of becoming a PE teacher is now something that is very much part of the work, certainly, that we are doing at the University of Edinburgh. And a big part of that is about the importance of integrating ideas from those different disciplines and the different curriculum and educational approaches. And therefore, for students, soon to become teachers, to develop this coherent educational vision for physical education is an important part, I would argue, of physical education now and in the future, because that's such an important part of their own professional development, their professional learning, but also, I would argue, for the development of physical education as a subject area in the future. So, very, very messy area, very congested, lots happening, very, very exciting. And the role of the physical education teacher is, I think, becoming something that's perhaps quite new and particularly important, and therefore their view, their vision, their beliefs as to what physical education will look like in the future becomes an important part of that whole agenda. So what do I mean by teacher vision? And this is an interesting one, because A lot of the original work on teacher vision from the 1980s was really very, very focused on exactly what teachers do in class, and to some extent, how they use their vision to see things. So it's quite a traditional, straightforward, positivist type of approach. But Karen Hammerness, at the turn of the century, really started to move that definition for personal vision forward. And I'll just read this out. Vision consists of images of what teachers hope could be or might be. And I think this becomes important in their classrooms, but their schools, their communities, and even in some cases in society. So vision can provide a sense of reach that inspires and motivates them and clearly invites them to reflect on their work over time. So I think we've got a good starting point here about something that acknowledges that teachers in the 21st century are professionals, and yes, classroom practice is a key part of their life, of their work, but also there is a whole range of different layers of our society, of our education system, where teachers increasingly have an impact. So therefore, here we go. Personal vision helps develop a picture of the learning they wish to achieve with their classes. Yes, we got that. Create a guide for negotiating and extending policy aspirations. So clearly in this neoliberal world, if we want teachers to be professionals as opposed to being technical teachers who simply implement government policy, they need to have the knowledge, skills, and motivations to negotiate and potentially challenge, but maybe extend policy aspirations. And vision is also, Schulman and Schulman really highlight how teachers' professional development is basically at the heart. Vision is at the heart of their professional development, because they are constantly negotiating within and between themselves, the school, and the policy levels. So that ecological interaction between the task of becoming teacher, their own characteristics, and the different environmental factors that impact upon that. And I'll talk a bit about that later. So we're already going classroom professional development at the heart of this complex professional aspect. And then possibly it is about vision, maybe about combating the fact that many neoliberal governments try to restrict and control teachers' curriculum voice. And I'm not sure that that would be a route for all teachers, but I think it's something that at least has to be put on the table for discussion. And I think Hammerness and a few others have highlighted, I think, what's a very, very useful, and maybe should have been the first quote: if you don't know where you're going, any path will do. And that, in a sense, responds to, if governments say do this, if you don't have a vision, if you don't have a clear picture of educationally where you're going and what you think the future should be, you will probably do anything that you're asked to do. So I'm only saying a few words about personal vision, but I think it's something that is unbelievably rich and unbelievably important for the future of education in countries, and I would argue across the globe. So at Edinburgh, we are working on the Personal Vision for PE project. This is a project that, although I'm going to, and in essence, I'm going to say that we're reporting on the first phase of that project, it would probably be fair to say that I've been working on this with Paul and others for about 6 or 7 years to get to the point that we can actually create the context for the students to focus in on their personal visions in a way that perhaps was less clear in the past. So we work with students on the MA. Now, MA stands for the Masters of Arts in Physical Education, and somewhat ironically, at the traditional universities of Scotland, an MA is actually an undergraduate degree, a 4-year undergraduate degree, and at the end of that, the students will become teachers of physical education. And sort of going back to the sort of the complex nature of physical education, the course that the students follow, in each year of the program, they study physical education, curriculum and pedagogy, and that takes up about 1/3 of their whole program. And they look at curriculum and pedagogy in physical education, working with children from the age of 3 and 4 right through to 18. So that's a huge part of the program. But they also, to support that, they study sport and exercise science, they study physical culture, educational studies, and also spend, over the period of time that they're in the program, 31 weeks in school context, and actually probably do a bit more than that. So it's a very important point that for our students to make sense of all of that, to bring it into an integrated vision, is in itself a complex process, because from a disciplinary perspective, these different subject areas have different viewpoints, and clearly there are many curriculum and educational ideas that the students are actually engaging with. So the study that we're doing is located in the final year course of PECP, Physical Education Curriculum and Pedagogy course. That course, which is, in fact, we just started it again last week, is really one of the final courses that the students do. And where in the past it has focused very much on students, focus this now on the idea of investigating and articulating their personal visions for physical education. And that will be a key part of the next 15 minutes as I talk through. We have employed, in a similar way, but perhaps in a more specific way, to Shulman and Shulman, an ecological perspective to support the students. And therefore, we look closely at them as individuals and the task and the subtask that link to becoming PE teacher. One is personal vision. Then we acknowledge the macro, the global, the national factors, and the micro factors, the immediate factors that influence their vision as they develop. So the course is very much about bringing together virtually everything that they've done when they were at school as pupils, right through to their final year as part of the university. And we look at that from this ecological perspective. In terms of the study, we made a decision to ask the students if we could look at their final essays. They had a 3,000-word essay, and we acknowledged that there are limitations or constraints that are put on the students, but they were asked for their personal visions for PE, the experiences that most influenced that vision, and for the second part of their essay to look at a strategic professional development plan on how they would go about enacting that vision in the early part of their career. Now, we used 20. There were almost 60 students who actually came forward to be part of the project, but we decided that we wanted to look at the essays who had some breadth across the different visions, some form of internal coherence across the different subcomponents, and I'll talk about that as we go through the findings, and some clarity for in retrospect, it may have been more helpful to look at more essays and perhaps some of the essays that were less coherent. But I think this gives us a very good starting point on a journey as these young people start to move through life as teachers. And as this is a longitudinal study, I think we can revisit this as we go through. And just that middle point in that slide, there were regular sessions to support the open-ended nature of the task. And I think it's very, very, very important for me to highlight that although we were reasonably clear in terms of what the structure of the essay may be, we completely wanted to hear the student voice in this. This was about their visions. It wasn't about us leading them down a pathway just to repeat our visions. And that in itself was an interesting part of the course, and supporting the students to actually have the confidence to put forward their voice as part of the process. Obviously, I don't have time, but there's the 4 of us were tutors in the program. All the data was completely anonymous, and the actual analysis took place about 4 months after the course was finished. And we went through a 5-step analysis process and ultimately concentrated on the influence of task, individual and environmental factors on the vision that they wanted. And the findings, certainly as a starting point for us, were extremely interesting. Now, it would be because obviously it was part of our course. And of course, we acknowledge our interest in this area and our ownership to some extent of some of the ideas. But as I will talk through, these visions were educationally focused, theoretically informed, which surprised us more, I think, than we expected. And they were also shaped by a range of ecological factors from the past and from the present, but also acknowledging the complexity of future would look like. In terms of the educational focus, 4 broad visions were highlighted. 12 of the students highlighted PE as being about a foundation for lifelong engagement in physical activity. 5 of them, holistic learning experiences, so therefore a move away from the dominance of the physical, but clearly the physical at the center. 2 focused on inclusion, and 1 of them focused on adaptive practice. And when we were writing the paper, we were asked to explain that. And clearly from that ecological perspective, adaptive practice fits into that notion of teachers being able to respond to particularly the environmental constraints to enact that vision, and therefore needing to be adaptable as to what they meet. Now, a really interesting point that then emerged was that while there was some similarity across these visions, the subcomponents were many, and some of them are a repeat of the main ones. But if you look at them, personalization, critical thinking, improvement aimed, well-being, engagement, all very much involved with a notion of the educational perspective that was, in a sense, is the focus of their course. So I keep getting emails jumping in from outside. So important for us, though, was that... Hello?
Mike, I will keep going on with I will follow the questions and answers after you make your presentation.
Okay, cool. Yep, just keep going. Yep. So, small number of broad overarching visions, but many subcomponents included within that. And critically, no student presented exactly the same subcomponents. So there was no student that actually had the same vision as any other student out of the 20 essays. And in fact, even within some of those, and I'll talk briefly about meaningfulness. Meaningfulness came up a few times, and there were quite nuanced differences between the way that students perceived that. So there was clearly, going back to the very beginning of this presentation, there was a wide range of the way that the students actually engaged with this and came up with this. From a theoretical perspective, more than we thought. And we saw constructs from salutogenesis, self-determination theory, meaningfulness, complexity. So students using ideas that they had been presented with throughout the context of their program. So again, giving them a slightly different view of what that vision would be. So therefore, different subcomponents within the visions, an alternative interpretation of subcomponents across the visions, and different theoretical perspectives. So I don't think we expected the students to be quite so diverse. So sort of broad similarity from an educational perspective, but as we looked at the nitty-gritty, as we drilled in, these were quite different. And as I talked earlier, and I'll do this reasonably briefly because I've covered a lot, the ecological influences about the individual, the environment, and the task. And this was related to their articulated vision. Individually, the connection to their early experiences and their current experiences as a pupil, as a student. And not surprisingly, some key individuals actually were really important in shaping their beliefs and their views about education. Interestingly, not a lot, but some of them recalled negative experiences, and that had an important influence on the way that they actually viewed the future of PE. Now, probably the essay format was not the best way to actually get the personal stuff. Interviews would have been helpful, but we certainly started to get a flavour of where these students were from. Environmentally, we saw that complex interplay about their visions between the different contexts, the micro, the macro, and in the middle, the meso. And just these three quotes from one student, student 7. It says student 7, but it's number 7. And this student highlighted how different the environment actually influenced the way that I think it was she developed her understanding of PE and her vision. So for initial teacher education, ITE, not only has my initial teacher education shaped my vision, I believe it's equipped me with the tools to successfully uphold my vision for PE as holistic and health related in my NQT. NQT means my newly qualified teacher year. So ITE influencing the environment, the demands of the school context. My placement in schools in the second year wasn't good. My vision for holistic was not achievable. I felt it might be appropriate to not become a teacher. But then the third placement was very supportive, and they valued teacher agency, and they helped fill that gap in her vision and practice. And then the acknowledgement that the national policy, that there is an educational shift towards teaching the whole child. So this is a student who's really got it, that some of the immediate stuff that's happening in their initial teacher education program and their school context and the national policy context environmentally is influencing the way that they view PE and is impacting upon their vision. Now, in terms of the task influences, and this is the final one, so we've looked at some of the individual influences, some of the environmental, and the tasks, acknowledging that a 3,000-word academic essay sort of was a significant synthesizing. What did happen was it was quite clear that there was some coherence for the students, or from the students, about the purpose of their personal vision, the ways that that would be enacted in practice, and the likelihood, and I think this is really important, they were conscious that they may have to change, and probably would have to change them, sometimes radically, as they moved into different environmental contexts. So they were up for articulating the purpose and how this vision may be enacted, but they were conscious that that may change in the future. So personal vision, I think, is perhaps underplayed and is a very important part of teachers' development, and I would argue for the profession that I'm interested in PE. I've reported on the early phase of a longitudinal project, and we've looked at some key similarities and differences across the division, and the fact that they were educationally focused and theoretically informed, and also how the influences that have shaped those visions and will continue in the future from that ecological perspective. And very much the students were aware that this was a foundation for what would happen as they entered the real world. And, excuse me, and finally, we are beginning to track the students. So we've got a starting point, and how much will the students' visions be washed out as they work their way through their education, they as become teachers. We will continue to develop and are very much, I have to confess, I think this year our course is much clearer than it has been in the past, and we've just started that. We're in week 4, and we're now, and this is an interesting part of the future, that the whole idea of personal vision is being introduced in year 1 of the program. And just yesterday, we had a rather amazing session where the 88 year 4 students, on a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 basis, shared their personal vision online on Create with year 1 students. So we've started that process for the PEC P4 students, articulating and sharing their vision, and the year 1 students listening. And a final point is, I think that as this project moves forward, I think we've got a positive starting point, but I think it's really important that we look to extend the research methodology so that we can really start to get some real life data as things move forward. So thank you very much for listening. Wee bit long, but not awful long. So back to you, Teresa.
Oh, thanks so much, Professor. It's perfect on time. And we have a question from Professor Pavlov Valdivia. He says to Professor Jess, do you believe physical education would be considered more relevant than soft skills, or in the same level to social science students, especially for low students? Latinos country, for example, don't have same vision of what is more important or relevant than English societies. Personally, I think insert physical education skills in law is very important too. Best regards, Professor Pablo Valdivia from Peru.